Okay, William, nice to see you. How are you doing?
I'm all right, Jonathan. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. We met through the OSF, the Open Society Fellowship Program. And when we began that program as a cohort, you were the kind of, how could I put this? You felt like a star because you'd recently written a paper about predictive policing that was not only important in its own terms and has some relevance to current debates around race and sort of structural racism. But it was more than that. It was also you were tapping into sort of a new form of life, albeit artificial life, in the world that's beginning to permeate multiple systems across society. So you seem to be on the pulse of something crucial. And since then, you've joined DeepMind in London, which is part of Google, broadly conceived. And you're now working more broadly on this, the notion of the algorithmic society. So I'm really happy to have a chance to talk to you. And I guess I want to, before we get into the nitty gritty, just allow our viewers to know you a little bit better. Where you did your PhD, what your current circumstances are, just so we
Yep.
can contextualize things a little bit.
I guess I'm never quite sure where to start with this, but I guess I'll start at like a reasonably far off in the past. My background, I'm a political science scientist by training. I got my PhD at Michigan State. And about my third or fourth year into my PhD, I had a chance encounter with Patrick Ball, who runs the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. And at the time, he was kind of looking for people who are interested in machine learning and also police reform because they were starting a new kind of like group to kind of focus on kind of harms that were being done in the name of human rights in the U.S. For people who are not familiar with the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, they are a group of statisticians and computer scientists who work on using techniques in machine learning to identify like harms in mostly in the international human rights context, but at the time I joined, was actually making their first foray into domestic U.S. Policy. And so I spent 3 years working there, and one of the kind of outputs of that was our work on predictive policing. This was a kind of, at the time, it was a very kind of far-flung topic where police departments around the country were adopting the use of machine learning algorithms to reallocate their policing forces based on patterns in historic data. And some of our critiques that we wrote about and discussed in op-eds and other places were challenging the notion that the historical data that were used in these algorithms were indeed unbiased. And as a part of that discussion, we had to blend research not just in machine learning, but also in thinking about critical race theory, thinking about like social construction and other kind of research to kind of weave together a better understanding of what is actually embedded in data beyond just the kind of artifacts that exist themselves.
Right.
And so, that has kind of, at the end of that kind of period with HRDAG, I was kind of interested to kind of expand beyond the realm of policing because at the time we saw increasingly that machine learning systems were being deployed in lots of contexts, whether it's in health, whether it's in public services, and other domains. And so I joined the Ethics and Society team at DeepMind to kind of expand upon that work. And so in my time there, I've kind of focused some on internal governance within the organization and within Google, and then another bit thinking and expanding upon the initial work on predictive policing to think about some of the ethical and human rights harms of machine learning and AI more broadly.
Okay. It sounds like the kind of frontier work, right? Do you feel like you're on a frontier? Like it has that feeling, like new terrain, be careful, here be dragons, that kind of thing. And yet, I mean, just to give it more context, I mean,
Yeah.
When I hear of, when I first grasped, I'm a chess player by background, so I was sort of somewhat aware of the power of machine learning as something distinct from mere computational power, whereby, this is what Daniel Schmachtenberger, for example, calls exponential technology. So it's technology that teaches itself how to be better technology. But better, of course, as you've already alluded to, is a very subtle judgment. And if you're building systems that are optimizing for something, you have to be very careful what they're optimizing for, because at a certain point, they can become relatively opaque. They can build on lots of data sets that join in various ways, until eventually you get to the point where decisions are being taken and outputs are happening that are judged to be good by the standards of the algorithm, but not necessarily by the standards of the designer. And it can also feel like it's somehow out of control. And I say that as a layman, and I know you can give me all sorts of reasons why what I've just said is not quite right. But just let me say that sense of, potential impact is only growing, right? There's a sense in which these machine learning algorithms are coming into almost every feature of our life. And the papers that you kindly shared with me laid out just how kind of imperious they can be. And also that because it's quite a competitive space, there's a certain urgency to get things done. And that time sensitivity is arguably locking in errors. So tell me, nuance the hell out of me there. What did I say wrong?
It's starting with the chess example. Chess is a very interesting kind of way to think about, one, the kind of evolution of like AI, but then also like our kind of dynamic with it as a society. If you can only go back to Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue, and this idea that it's man versus machine, and we're in this kind of locked in this this kind of competitive struggle.
Just to say, I remember being interviewed around that time saying, who do you think will win? And I to my sort of embarrassment now, in 96 or 97, sorry, I said, I think Kasparov will win because computers have limitations. They can't, all the old stuff, like they can't deal with intuition. They can't deal with subtle features of the position that are longer term. And of course, come to 2020, and that all seems like ludicrous. Your smartphone can beat your average grandmaster very easily. And
that is in itself like a kind of interesting evolution to your point about the kind of like exponential increase in capability that we've seen in kind of modern technology. And I think what's interesting now, so like following along with the chess analogy, so you kind of had like AlphaGo, which obviously DeepMind pioneered, and then kind of like AlphaZero, which kind of plays chess as well. And you kind of got to this point where it's kind of observed that the level of skill that like AlphaZero has, it's not one that's in the kind of domain of human gameplay. And so now the competition is between Stockfish and AlphaZero, right? And so now you have these two agents that are playing, but like you said, you're going back to the measure of what's best, right? So we judge these artificial agents based on ELO scores, or like are we talking about other things like creativity or like ingenuity, the things that you said, like why the human could or should win in a matchup? And I think that all relates to the questions about like what is machine learning like optimized to do and where does it fall short. And that like it's less obvious in chess because chess is a human game with firm rules and firm boundaries, right? There's only so many pieces on a chessboard. The pieces have precise movements, and there's firm rules about how they should interact. When you move outside of that and you move into the real world, right, all that breaks down. And machine learning systems are really good at understanding known rules and making decisions to optimize this particular goal, which in the case of a competitive like a zero-sum game is to win. Right? It's different when the goal is to like improve welfare of a society. It's to reduce crime. It's to, and so when you start moving in that domain, there's more questions that society demands out of it. What I demand out of a computational system when it's playing chess is just understanding, okay, well, tell me where to move.
Right.
But the level of explanation you need when you're saying, help us manage a police force,
Yeah.
help us manage a hospital system, you need more information as to why it makes the decisions that it
Yeah.
makes.
No, totally.
And,
And I can report that, as a grandmaster, when I saw Alpha Zero play for the first time, the chess player in me was really, really impressed. I mean, it was unbelievable, almost. I think Demis Hassapis himself called it like another life form or extraterrestrial in some way. It did seem like an amazing way of looking at the game. Lots of the decisions were ideas we wouldn't expect even the very best grandmasters, even some of the best computers to play. However, while the chess player in me was excited, I didn't feel that excited as a sort of citizen, as someone who cares about our chance of dealing with cascading ecological collapse or dealing with various social and psychological issues of the day. It wasn't obvious to me that this was something that would gradually morph into that more complex socially generative function. It did still feel quite narrowly focused. And I wonder how you feel about, you've said already that one is more complicated, but are we speaking difference in degree or difference in kind?
I think both. You know, just I think in terms of questions around like just the level of compute needed to solve very complex challenges. We think about climate change, we think about other challenges, right? Like the level of compute you would need to just kind of execute very, very difficult challenges in large space problems is like we shouldn't underestimate that. But in addition to it, in the kind of structure of machine learning designed around kind of like an optimization function. We're saying we want to pick a particular metric and optimize for it is a distinct type of thinking about like a problem solution dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
and that is not always helpful when you're thinking about social problems, right?
Right.
And of course, now going back obviously to the kind of like my own personal interest in research, that the kind of construction of A, the metrics, and B, the decision of what metrics are what we're optimizing for have in them, embedded biases that often marginalize some groups and position others at the center of the benefits of the systems that are being deployed. And I think when we think of it from that way, right, these tools in when deployed incorrectly or deployed or misdeployed can actually exacerbate societal harms and actually erode the kind of things that we would want to see as a society continue to grow, or the way we'd want to see like computation and machine learning be used in the world.
Right. So I hear you, and I've heard this said already, that
Yeah.
on the one hand, machine learning, I mean, first of all, just on terminology,
Yes.
machine learning is where AI is at now, right? So how do you demarcate the two? So you speak of AI as
Yeah.
the general class and that machine learning is one particular thing, or is it now
Yes.
less clear cut?
Yeah. So, the way to kind of think about it is, AI is this kind of very large overheading. And like within AI, you can have machine learning as like a kind of like a component of it, right? That's really based around the idea of using statistics and computational methods to like derive connections between like data points,
Mhm.
right? And like, but historically, the field of AI wasn't really built around machine learning, right? It was actually, they comprised lots of different techniques, right? Symbolic learning and others that are actually like less in that kind of domain of computation as what's driving it, right? There were people like symbologists who really thought that what you really need to do is have really complex logic systems that were able to make connections between lots of different salient like artifacts in the world, and that's what would get you to like artificial intelligence, right? Systems that were like, that use some form of logic or data to be able to like replicate human level like capabilities,
Okay.
right? So like in historically in the field, there's a kind of like canonical areas of focus. So you see a lot of work on vision, on language, right, on control. So
Mhm.
there are different elements of like what is artificial intelligence, and like and to kind of separate that like as one general division, there's lots of discussion around narrow AI. So like, say I want to use, computer vision to recognize faces, or what we would now call facial recognition systems, right? Or you might have general AI, right, or AGI, where you have systems that are capable of doing multiple sets of tasks, right, at human level capability. Those are much less rare, and we haven't actually, those is more theoretical than actual at this point,
Right. So I was going
right?
to
And
get to that.
so,
I wanted to ask about that because I want to come to ethics in a minute. But you know,
yeah.
in the general public's mind, when they think of AI, they're without realizing it, they may be thinking of AGI, right?
I
Even
would have, oh,
I mean, just to say, I mean, what I mean
yeah,
by that is
yeah,
in popular
yeah,
culture, when they present, you know,
yes, yeah,
images of the robots and the, you know,
yeah.
Terminators or whatever that are coming for us. But your sense and mine, for what it's worth, is that AGI is still a promissory note in some ways, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's yeah. I would say I think there is the kind of sci-fi and kind of early visions of like AI is like one is like a humanoid,
Mm.
right, and two like kind of this highly capable like superhuman capability
Mm.
across multiple domains, right? Like that is the kind of sci-fi depiction that like is like that's presented, and like I think like the reality of what like a like artificial general intelligence will look like is like an aspiration, right? It's like kind of like the kind of goalpost that we're marching to. And like along the way, we've developed just like lots of like kind of advancements in like kind of individual silos of the kind of like
Yeah,
levels of like or the areas or domains that we think will be necessary
right.
for like for general intelligence, like vision, like
But
language,
there's a
etc.
presumption of emergence, right? There's a presumption that somehow, if you master these multiple discrete domains and they begin to learn from each other somehow, that there's this emergent property in which is something more like general intelligence. But
Yeah,
is it, you know, because there are others who think this will never happen, right? Or who think there's
yeah.
some kind of category mistake going on. I think I read something by David Deutsch to this effect. But basically that there's a reason why we haven't made that progress, and it's because the premise is not right somehow. Um, is that the spirit, you know, within the kind of organizations you've been part of, you know, are they all true believers? Does everyone think that we'll get some kind of AGI inevitably, or are there skeptics, or how would you view it?
Yeah, I think there's a spectrum, right? I think there are people who are, who truly do believe that, like general intelligence from artificial systems is, just around the corner. And there's some people who are very skeptical that we are framing the problem the right way, that like the kind of current approach will get us there. And I think that's kind of what's so fascinating about kind of research, is because like it is this kind of open space to kind of like both like kind of answer those questions and pose new ones.
Mm.
And I myself do not I don't traffic in the predictions around AGI, just
Right.
because from my own personal view, I'm just more curious about the evolution
Sure.
of like these technologies, and more specifically how they will affect
Yeah.
society.
Okay.
And so like that's a like I guess watching the capabilities increase, but then also cognizant about like even their development, their application is actually the far more crucial problem,
Okay.
about what will happen when you have even just significantly more capable systems than we have today.
Okay. No, I understand. So let me come to ethics, because
Yeah.
that was one of your main focuses for a while. Now, look, you know, back in the day, I did philosophy, and you do ethics as an undergraduate. And if you go on to study ethics in more depth, you get to a subject called meta-ethics, which is about, you know, different sort of theories of ethical theories, and trying to get the sort of premises clear and demarcating the main roots of different ethical ideas. So here's why I mention that, is that my sense is that for machine learning, it's relatively easy to compute some kind of meta-ethics. And by compute, I mean operationalize, turn into code, turn into algorithms, and relatively hard to do the same for others. So what I'm thinking is Kantian or deontological ethics of this is right and this is wrong, these are the rules, these are, you know, this is what you must do, relatively easy to operationalize in a machine learning environment. And similarly, utilitarianism, some sort of evaluative function to get to an optimal outcome where you can, in principle, say what the greatest happiness for the greatest number or something like that is. So a consequential view of ethics. But the sort of traditions of virtue ethics, or theories where we're dealing with qualities of goodness and flourishing and virtue, and the virtues, so courage and wisdom and temperance and whatever else, they seem to be much harder to put into an algorithmic system. First of all, is that right? And if it is, how much might it matter?
I think it matters to a significant degree, and I would say I think your kind of taxonomy I think was actually pretty good. I was impressed that for coming at it from someone who is not steeped in machine learning. That was a very good observation. Yes, I would say to take it one step further, thinking about both deontological and thinking about utilitarianism. Right, they're kind of almost baked into machine learning, right? So a lot of modern machine learning systems, right, are utility maximizers, right? What they're doing is they're kind of surveying what is the utility of me taking X step versus Y step, and then this one yields a higher return, so I do that, right? And so it is easier to conceive models of what is ethical around those kind of systems of thinking. Now, the challenge has been, and I think, when we talk about the term AI ethics, right, why it's kind of a hodgepodge is in part because in practice, right, you could have a system that kind of confined to those kind of ways of thinking, right, but actually could lead to actual harm in society, right? Because I always think, there's different ways of thinking about it, and I think different people have approached the problem. Whether you're thinking about someone like Nick Bostrom, who thinks about in the yeah, but even someone like Kathy O'Neill in Weapons of Mass Destruction, right? You think about systems that are optimized for trying to just identify who should be where should police go, right? And that leads to lots of negative police interactions. That leads to communities feeling oppressed, right? And it leads to people getting either harmed by the police, right, or having people feel they're they're unable to kind of achieve their standing in society. And so you kind of have this ripple effect where you're only optimizing for one goal, right? And you have all these negative externalities that cascade from it, right? And you can have a system that is confined to those rules, but misses others. And so ideally I think what is the world of AI ethics is moving towards is a kind of composition of lots of different kinds of ethics. And in some ways the field is trying to reconcile how best to constitute a ethics or a guidebook for what we should do when you have a highly flexible, highly malleable system that is really trying to optimize for a kind of narrow set of metrics. And so it is. And I will say on this one point, one also thing I would like to see us push back on is also incorporating non-Western ethics into the thing. There's been a lot of great work that's been done recently on thinking about, let's say, principles of Ubuntu as it relates to machine ethics, right? Obviously, the emergence of China as a AI power, they have started writing their own sets of AI principles or AI ethics principles in line with Eastern philosophy. So
Confucian or Taoist, or do you know more detail there?
So I will profess I've researched them lightly, but I would say one prominent distinction is the shift from the individual to the communal.
Right.
That I think is a very important distinction for how we think about where the harms of algorithmic systems lie, and the idea of promoting solidarity and unity, right, as a goal of systems, right? That's very different than what we talk about even amongst the kind of enumerated kind of ethical principles of fairness or non-discrimination, explainability, and redress in kind of more Western AI ethics documents, right? Is there is a balance and tension there, and I think that's actually a really important thing to think about as this field begins to emerge of like what is the kind of philosophical basis for those, and
Okay.
I I don't know if we're going to get to like a kind of monolithic like kind of set of ethical or universal ethical principles, but I think it will be more of a kind of multipolar world that has respect and balance for
All right.
different ethics and how we should apply them to artificial systems.
Okay, that's very interesting. So in principle, just as we have an idealized notion of maybe the UN having checks and balances and trying to work for the greater good of planetary civilization, in principle, you could have the tech giants and governments and citizens in conversation and a nimble enough learning system that you can build a diverse set of inputs for forms of ethical understanding that can be optimized in a way that you can factor in multiple variables that are somehow balanced or weighted, and the learning happens in such a way that there is some kind of convergence on the optimal level of harmony or well-being across the world. I mean, in principle, I think I see how that might work. Although in practice, this is what I want to come to.
Yep.
You shared these wonderful papers with me, they're quite core to your research. Included a sort of New Yorker piece about machine learning for the sort of lay reader, a review in Nature about how this is going to work academically. And the thing that jumped out at me the most was this idea of intellectual debt, sometimes called technical debt. I think they're probably the same or similar. And the idea basically is that as I reading between the lines, and this wasn't explicit in the papers, but I can imagine a competitive, high intelligence workplace where you often get scientific fame on the basis of being first. The desire to create new things based on old data is very strong. And the desire to put things together without checking whether they belong together is very strong in order to get to some form of innovation in machine learning. And the reason I mention this is that the idea of intellectual debt and technical debt is, through machine learning, we're getting a huge amount of theoryless knowledge, like things that work that we don't know how they work. Like I was struck by the New Yorker piece where it says that that already happens in pharmaceuticals. People take drugs all the time, and if you read the small print, we don't know how this works, it just does, right? And that's maybe okay for an individual dealing with a headache or whatever. But when it's something about the criminal justice system and the education system and the health system, and potentially how we measure energy and how much we need and where it comes from and who's rewarded and all the rest of it, the mind boggles a bit if we move towards a society of enormous intellectual and technical debt, which, if I'm not mistaken, is growing. So please tell me I've got this wrong and that actually in practice it's going to be altogether better.
Well, I would say I think the optimistic perspective is that I think more people are now aware of this limitation, and I think are trying to figure out how to navigate towards this. But I think what is at its core is a shift of kind of the, like you said, the kind of like pursuit of innovation, right? Just like moving the needle further on established metrics to rethinking about the use of machine learning and AI to have social benefit, to actually improve or advance society. And when you shift that framing, as I mentioned before, you ask different questions. Explainability matters when you want to impact society, because when you're saying, I need to understand why this system is, improving test scores in children, why this system is like, driving these outcomes, because that's how we actually spread the benefits to different domains, different contexts that are not the one that we're initially testing in, right? The generalizability of a particular innovation matters a great deal when when you have the ability to explain it. And
Right.
so I think that shift of looking not just to advance the needle and publish another paper, but to have impact in the world is driving this kind of this kind of pursuit of new questions and new understandings, and making greater demands of the systems, right? Because obviously, even to couple it even further, so even questions around redress or contestability, right? You need systems that are going to be able to say, I can explain to you what I did, and if I'm wrong, you can interact with me and tell me that like this is wrong because of this reason and this reason. that's where we would hope to get to. And I think it's first having to acknowledge why we struggle to actually to kind of ask those questions now. And part of it is the kind of intellectual and technical debt. A lot of the systems, right, the quick wins come from kind of taking what is and making a small modification, right, to say we've made some advancement. But without questioning the things underneath, right, we've kind of gotten to this point where like, oh no, like, how do we rethink this whole kind of spaghetti of like technical and intellectual kind of
Yeah.
artifacts to be able to reposition it. And but I would say the good news is that I think this has been the community of researchers are tackling this problem,
Right.
right? And I think one area you clearly see this in is actually lots of interrogations of like data sets. So like in both computer vision and computer language, you've seen a kind of like a cohort of younger researchers who have actually gone through and taken the time to review hundreds of thousands and millions of images and like snippets of language to see how the initial researchers labeled or coded that information.
Right.
So they've kind of found like numerous cases of bias in the kind of coding and evaluation of these images. And because of that, now those researchers have been prompted to go back and reassess them and change them so that they're more aligned with kind of like both the standards of society and also the aims of having a beneficial outcome.
Right. So I know you have to go in a minute, so I'll try and make this the last question, but it's quite a big one. I'm thinking of what you're saying and trying to feel positive about it. So, no one wants to be a technophobe, right? Everyone wants to believe they're on the right side of history. And as I imagine the future for my children and everything else, I like to think that there can be some kind of harmony between benign technological advance, sort of ecological sanity, the right kind of social cohesion, the right amount of individual freedom, an economy that works for everyone. And this can happen on a planet of 8+ billion people. And that we might somehow get there, stumble through the current crises we face. And when I think of that, it's often in a kind of planning mentality. It's often in a mind that says, well, how do we do this? Can we back up and see this, and which moves should we make? But the world is so chaotic. It's already underway. They have a lot of hysteresis baked into the world system as a whole. And so if I imagine even the best and brightest and the most well-intentioned people in a room, but they have some ideological differences, right? So you may have your progressive thinker alongside your classical liberal. You may have a libertarian, and you may have a socialist. And you may have some who don't identify with any of those things, but have a particular interest in Taoism, and you have someone else. Anyway, you can imagine a team, that you're a team of diverse, brilliant, ethically plural people trying to come up with learning systems that work at scale. And the reason I say that is because the growth of these systems does make it look like they're going to permeate every aspect of life eventually. And so therefore, what I'm asking is, do you think it's possible in principle to get to that kind of convergence? Or is it more likely, as I fear it might be, that the sort of value incommensurability that's baked into all human decision-making will make it very difficult to get the kind of convergence and continual learning we need for machine learning systems at scale to operate for the greater good?
So I think let's take a step back. I think the future will not lie merely in just the kind of technical innovation alone.
Sure.
I think the world in which we're moving to is like what I try to kind of promote as an idea of kind of socio-technical development.
Yeah.
Where it's a dialogue and exchange between society and the kind of like technological advancements. And so your question around the kind of like can we get to convergence? I think we should like be positive based on the trajectory that we have seen, even just in the short time period where we've actually started to make a huge investment into exploring kind of like what is an ethical set of machine learning systems. When I started like working in this space 4 or 5 years ago, the idea that kind of fairness and non-discrimination would be a universally applied kind of standard for what a machine learning system should do was not even like, it wasn't even a thought in people's minds.
Yeah.
Now it is kind of like one of the first requirements, even for people who are developing it. And so do we have ways to go to kind of tease out what that means and how that applies in different contexts? Absolutely. So like, I think we should be optimistic that we will make further gains. I think the concerns that I have are in terms of who should be a part of this discussion is the thing I worry about. I think there are lots of really smart people who are ethicists, but I think even within that, like, we should include communities that are experiencing this firsthand to be able to provide guidance as to what is fair and acceptable and just use of these systems.
So,
and yeah.
Well, just to say, because we've spoken of this a little bit before, but
Yeah.
the underlying concern in my question, I mean, I hear you on socio-technical, and I see the good intentions, but I worry that the nature of the creature, the artificial creature, is something that will grow by itself, beyond our control. And that's, I guess, what I'm trying to tease out, is that sense of opacity, lack of explainability, but also just no longer knowing quite which aspect of it to change, because it's so.
I would say I think it's a choice. I hear your concern about kind of this like escalation of debt and of intellectual and technical debt that leads us to kind of systems that might be like highly functional and optimizing for certain metrics, but completely unexplainable and unaccountable. And I think my response is that I think that is one version of the future, but I don't think that's the version of the future that is most likely, because of this kind of exchange, not just between other researchers, but researchers and society, right? Society is asking researchers to say, no, you need to think about it differently. It won't be valuable to us. And I will say this specifically because the aperture is not necessarily full on advancement and expansion into the world, right? And or kind of some middle ground. It's really expand a greater impact in the world or abolishment, right? And then we've seen lots of communities push back and say, we don't want this technology in our systems, right, in our society, right? You look at the work of Stop LAPD Spying that has ended the kind of use of surveillance systems by the LAPD, right? You saw the whole kind of pushback against facial recognition, right, in the bans that we've seen in multiple jurisdictions, right? That is a case where communities have said, this is too opaque, this is not accountable, we don't want the technology. So by having this socio-technical dialogue, researchers now know, look, okay, we can't assume that we can continue on in that trajectory and that we'll get to this kind of glorious future where we have this kind of ubiquitous uptake of the technology. And so that is why I'm kind of optimistic that you won't have this kind of creep, and that there will be a pushback. But the challenge is, how do we do it? Because like you said, part of the reason why it exists is because it's just easy. It's easy to just add a kind of a few bells and whistles rather than diving deeper into the systems and understanding where the mistakes were made, where is the design flaws, and actually innovated in a different way and having that count as success rather than just applying to the kind of existing stack of opaque systems. And so I think that new way of thinking is underway. And I think some of the work that we've done on kind of causality and kind of trying to visualize how the data sets are constructed in those relationships, right? And an example of trying to kind of pull back some of the opaqueness within the architecture of these systems to be able to visualize how an algorithm system makes a decision and can kind of interact and engage with communities to say, is this a real representation of the causal relationships in a particular case or not? And if it is, right, what are the ones that are biased, and how can we understand how we can take that form of bias that we know is visible and pull it away? It doesn't solve all the forms of bias, but it can begin to engage communities and stakeholders in that dialogue. So I think that future is possible. It's not guaranteed, but I think more people than not can recognize that is a path that we'll need to take to have the impact that we want to have in the world.
Okay, thanks a lot. Listen, one more thing if you don't mind, just because we have two more minutes. You're a political scientist, so if you can momentarily take your sort of technological hat and keep it on the table, but don't think with it so much. Recent issues around race that we've experienced, not just Black Lives Matter, not just sort of systemic or algorithmic bias, but how, you said already you're quite optimistic in one domain. How optimistic are you that we can sort of take race with the requisite seriousness without getting lost somehow in perpetual guilt or critique or whatever the problem would be of staying with it too much? How can we get to the optimal level of being aware of race as an issue without being and redressing it? And you help me out here. How can we get to the place we want to be on race?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think in some ways it's always a bit tricky to kind of like kind of view it from the lens of kind of holding on to guilt, right? I think in some ways, right, there's a kind of two-part problem. I think it's like, I think most people of color, like, we want recognition and acknowledgement of like equal standing in society, right? But in pursuit of that has to be an acknowledgement of past harms. And I find that people sometimes struggle with those two things in tandem, right? Some people are really about equality, but are really against like recognition of historical harms. But the two are in tandem, right? To understand someone's lived experience, right, it's not enough to say, well, I view you as the equal, right, but I don't understand why. And I guess as it relates to our kind of discussion around like algorithm systems, right, you could tell a system it is fair, but if you don't understand, like you can't explain why, then it's very difficult to kind of have a real understanding or explainability as to the decisions that you'll make in the future, right? And I think that's the first step. And I think, like, and I would say it seems like a form of your question is like, being a good ally in this conversation. And I think part of it is actually doing that education, right? I find that a lot of people of color have to do the additional emotional labor of trying to be the educator and producers of evidence about the historical harms. But these things are in plain view. They're not hidden. And so I think it would be important to understand the full history of, of colonialism, right, of systemic racism, and be able to engage with that material. And I think, I would be surprised if people come away from doing that kind of education to kind of come with a different interpretation of like what it would take to get your peers in the Black community to feel as equals, to feel as like you're on the same footing. Because I think when you understand it, you understand the remedies for that are very different, right? Like, non-discrimination is great, but that's the difference between equality and equity, right? Like, like to get equity, you have to kind of, and it's not an easy, I would say it's not trivial to kind of like say, well, if I just read the history, I will understand what to do, because it's actually, I mean, it is a difficult challenge. It's not easy, but I think what I have seen from the recent like protests and the kind of like, kind of things that have flowed from that is a willingness to engage in that discussion, right? To actually think about the kind of historical legacy, what it means, and what society we want. And I think if we want a society where everyone is treated equal, where everyone is given a fair opportunity to advance, then we know that part of that is going to have to be dismantling systems that have for so long perpetuated and oppressed groups, and try to reimagine what society should look like. And that's going to look different than what society looks like today, but that's okay. Like, I just imagine, someone who works in technology, I try to also be a student of technology. And if you go back in a time machine 10, 15 years, we had no Facebook, no Twitter, no iPhone, right? And if you were to tell someone that time point about the world to now, they would not believe that it would be possible, right? That everyone would be walking around with like, $1,000 phone in their pockets, right? That's like the same power as like a supercomputer, like, from the 80s, right? It just would seem unfathomable, right? But it happened. So I think we can also do it in other domains of our life, right? Like we can change, like the vision of the world we want that is just is possible, right? It's not, I mean, it's not easy, but the world can change. And I think that's the kind of spirit that we need to take with it, and acknowledge that it will be difficult. It requires deep thinking. It requires the humbleness. And I think that will be, I think we'll see if that emerges. But I guess I'm more optimistic than others, because I think there's a lot of people who seem invested in changing, in redesigning the way we kind of construct our society.
I'm so happy you're optimistic. And as you were speaking there, I'm reminded of two things to close on. One is you've just written a paper on connecting your work in machine learning with decolonial thinking and critical race theory and so forth, which I'm looking forward to reading before asking you about again. And secondly, we actually spent some time together on Gorey Island. So in terms of getting to at least some experiential access to some of the roots of these issues, that was a happy memory to share. Look, I'd love to speak to you again, William, and I'm very grateful for your time. Thanks a lot, and talk to you later.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.